All right, John McMullen's got the latest NFL news and notes. We got a lot to dive into, so let's do it with John here on the Sports Bash 97.3 ESPN. We got a lot happening before tomorrow's legal tampering, John.
Yeah, you guys don't like oxymorons. Come on, have some fun.
Bittersweet.
If you just open free agency tomorrow, then you have the illegal tampering period back because everybody would start days earlier. In reality, they do, so it's silly, but at least you can be a little bit more above board with it instead of working out deals when you're not supposed to. So in that way, it's a little bit better.
Right. Well, we know the Eagles are going to be active and most likely wide receiver. You write at 973ESPN.com. The Eagles looking to make a splash at wide receiver. Is that via draft? Is that via free agency? Do you expect tomorrow we hear something? Is it via trade?
Well, it could be all of the above, but it's looking pretty clear that the Eagles understand, like all of us do, how bad that position was for them last season, and they want to add two meaningful bodies at that position, completely revamp things around Carson Wentz. And they have a plan in place, a philosophy. They sort of want a guy with size on the outside to complement a speed threat, which would be the Brandon Cooks type, which is their top option. And that's how they want to go. And if you think about it, they've been connected to just about every big-name receiver on the market from Alshon Jeffrey on down. And with their current cap space, there's just not the capability of adding two players, say the caliber of Brandon Cooks and even a lesser free agent like a Kenny Britt or somebody of that nature, unless they start releasing, trading certain players. And we all know the names. It starts with Connor Barwin, Michael Kendricks, even Jason Kelsey and Alan Barber, players like that, even Jordan Matthews, which is a name surprising to some people. But word is the Eagles have him on the market, because if you're going to bring in two receivers, all of a sudden Jordan Matthews isn't all that important for you. So there's going to be a lot of movement, and it's going to start pretty quickly.
John, you mentioned a couple of the names that are out there as being shopped around and are on the market. How much do you think Britt will be looking for?
Well, unfortunately, when you get to free agency, and I think Lee Steinberg tweeted it out today, you generally get a bunch of B or B-plus players getting A-plus contracts. And one of the reasons I think the Eagles are interested in Kenny Britt, because of some of his history and off-the-field dealings, is he'll be a little cheaper than other guys who have size. Alshon Jeffrey's going to break the bank. I think he's going to end up in San Francisco. Terrell Pryor even is going to be up, I think, over the $10 million range. And then if you get to Kenny Britt, maybe you can get him at $7 or $8 million. I think that makes him a little more desirous for the Eagles.
Yeah, Kenny Britt's a guy who I find interesting because of the connection with Groh. Can you get him on that kind of secondary price scale, pay scale, I guess I should say? You know, is he in the 6 to 8? Is he in the $7 to $9 million range, as opposed to the 10 to 12 you need to pay for the Deshaun Jackson, Kenny Stills type?
Yeah, and I think he will be cheaper than those guys. It's a question of how much and how desperate other teams are. Obviously, supply and demand drives the market, but he will be a little bit cheaper, and that's why I think you see his name coming up to the forefront a little bit, as opposed to a Kenny Stills, for instance. But I think Stills would fit more in the category of the speed threat. And the fact that dichotomy I mentioned that they want a speedy guy, and they want to complement him with a guy who has size on the outside. If they can't get a Cooks, all of a sudden you have to start looking at a Kenny Stills, which is much less cost-effective from the Eagles' standpoint, because he, as the free agent, is going to cash in whereas Cooks is still under his rookie deal.
John McMullen's with us, 97.3 ESPN.com. You mentioned Jordan Matthews. There was a Charles Robinson kind of, I don't want to say report, but that just kind of glossing that the Eagles would be interested in trading him. Does that make sense to you? Because there's a lot of people that are kind of saying, well, why would they get rid of their best guy? Explain the thought process there for Philadelphia.
Well, they wouldn't get rid of their best guy, but if their best guy becomes their third best guy overnight, then they would be entertained getting rid of him. And that's what I said. Say if if you're able to swing a deal for Brandon Cooks and you sign Kenny Britt in free agency, well, all of a sudden Jordan Matthews is your third receiver, and he's not nearly as important to this offense. So that's where the willingness to potentially move him comes in, is the fact that the Eagles know they have to get better at that position. They know they have to get significantly better, and their mentality is they can't go into another season with Jordan Matthews being their top receiver, even their second best receiver. They don't want that. They want to improve the position, and Howie kind of gave, he didn't flat out say it in Indianapolis, but when he talked about building this team around Carson Wentz, that's what he's talking about. Jordan Matthews as your best or even your second best receiver isn't good enough, and the Eagles are trying to improve.
Yeah, there's no question that you're going to hear a lot of names. Pryor's name has been mentioned. Every receiver that's on the list has been mentioned, right? So tomorrow, when legal tampering begins, is your anticipation, John, that somebody's name will be he is expected to sign Thursday with the Eagles?
I do expect him to strike pretty quickly, whether it's on the trade market or a signing. I don't think they're in play for Jeffrey or Pryor, just because they're going to be just too much money. So I think those guys are out of the question, and then you start to go down from there. And I think, unfortunately, because of the salary cap issues they're having, they have to make quick decisions. I think, as I said, they're trying to trade Connor Barwin. If they can't trade him, he's going to be released relatively soon. That'll give them an extra $7.75 million. So all these dominoes are going to start falling pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's funny because there's a lot of receivers out there that could. You mentioned I say, and you brought this up on Friday. This is why I want to throw this at your way. You would trade the 14th pick in a blink, right? And I happened to hear you last night on some national radio saying something very similar to that. That if the Eagles want to offer 14 and they're willing to do it, you do that immediately. Why? It goes into the situation where if you have Cooks and then if you can get a Britt and Matthews, all of a sudden for the 14th pick, you have considerably upgraded your wide receiver position.
Yeah, you have.
And so in that position, then I probably wouldn't look to trade Matthews, is my point.
Well, it's just when you do lose your first-round pick, there are other issues they have to address as well. And they have to get a cornerback, probably more than one cornerback. They would like another defensive end. So they do have other issues as well. So that's the back end of it. You need to add bodies at other positions. And you're losing a very, very valuable asset. My mentality, though, is people overrate first-round picks. It's not. It's proven over time and time again. And with that 14th pick, it's just we see it all the time. I was on Twitter with a couple fans, and they're saying, well, Mike Williams is much better than Brandon Cooks. How could you make that declarative statement? I mean, one guy's a two-time 1,100-yard receiver who's only 23 years old, and the other guy wouldn't run at the combine, and people are questioning whether he could even run a 4.5.
It's the whole notion of the car's value decreases as soon as it drives off the lot theory.
Yeah, and you're right, and it just doesn't make sense to me. And I look at Laquan Treadwell, who was a tremendous college receiver. Unbelievable. Very in the same vein as a Mike Williams, ran a 4.36 at the combine. Guess what? He couldn't get on the field. That's not to say he can't turn into a decent NFL receiver, because a lot of it is just sort of learning how to run routes and savvy. And guys like Jerry Rice, who ran a 4.7, and Chris Carter are in the Hall of Fame, and Anquan Bolden can still do it. But those are veteran guys who develop savvy over years and years and years. If you run a 4.6 in today's NFL, you're not going to hit the ground running. It's going to be a difficult process because you're not going to be able to get separation from NFL defensive backs. Whereas you have Brandon Cooks, a guy who's proven that he can be successful and be a top-tier receiver in this league. And I'm not just talking about the Eagles. I'm talking about a philosophy as a whole, whether it's Tennessee. New England has already reportedly offered their first-round pick for him. It's very unlikely if you're picking at 32, like the Patriots, that you're going to get Brandon Cooks. They understand that. They're willing to give it up. And then you talk from there. Tennessee, Philadelphia, it's a little bit more difficult because obviously at 14, you have a better chance to get a difference maker than 32.
Hey, John, you mentioned the name Jordan Matthews earlier as you and Mike were going back and forth on possible scenarios of what may play out. What kind of trade value do you think Jordan Matthews might have?
That's interesting. I mean, I call him a volume guy in that because sort of like a 20-point scorer on a bad NBA team. He's put up decent numbers for the Eagles, but he's not really shown consistent hands. Obviously, he doesn't have the speed, and he's been pigeonholed as a slot guy. So, but he is very young, and he has been productive, and he does certain things very well. And the second part is he's a tremendous asset to your locker room. He's a very smart kid. He's a model citizen. So all of that comes in. I think he would have, third round, certainly maybe a fourth round conditional pick value. And this is not to say the Eagles want to trade him or are looking to trade him. I don't believe they are at this particular moment. What I'm trying to say is, and I think what Charles Robinson was trying to say is, if you add, say, Brandon Cooks or Kenny Stills, and then you add Kenny Britt on top of that, all of a sudden you might think about moving Jordan Matthews because he's not going to be nearly as important to your offense.
John McMullen with us, and he writes on 97.3 ESPN.com, Eagles looking to make a splash at wide receiver, and you write that they've been linked to just about every wide receiving name out there that's set to hit the open market. Alshon Jeffrey, we discussed, Deshaun Jackson, Kenny Stills, Kenny Britt, Terrell Pryor. Cooks has also been mentioned as a possible trade scenario with the Eagles. Well, which name, John, which one will we hear tomorrow that's going to sign with the Eagles on Thursday? Which name do you think comes out of their mouths?
Well, I think the most likely right away is I think Cooks or Kenny Britt, and I think that's the Eagles' first choice, as I wrote on 973ESPN.com. I think that's the duo they would like to put together, and it fits what they want. As far as having the speed guy, that would be Cooks, and the guy with size on the outside, that would be Britt. That would be their best case scenario. However, as we've stated, the Patriots, the Titans seem to be in a better position with more ammunition to swing a trade for Brandon Cooks. So then you start thinking, who else on that list is the speed guy? And I think it goes to Kenny Stills. And if you can't get Kenny Stills, then I think it goes to Deshaun Jackson. So you always have to have a plan A, a plan B, a plan C. On the outside, look, I don't think they could get, as I said, Alshon Jeffrey or Terrell Pryor. I just don't think they have the money.
Are they worth that, though? I mean, are you okay? If you end up with Britt for less money or overpay for Jackson or Pryor, I'm okay with going after Britt, and then maybe going down the route you went last year with the 1 year prove it to me for a guy like Marcus Wheaton or Kendall Wright or even Marquise Wilson in Chicago, some guy that's going to come in and get a shot to prove it. Not like last year where you needed those guys to be your best receivers and they both didn't make the team. These guys would just be, hey, come on in and prove it because I spent less money to get Kenny Britt.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a safer route to go. I'd be very concerned about Terrell Pryor only because he's still learning the position. Obviously, the athleticism is there. You don't question that. But I think he's still very, very raw. I don't have any questions about Alshon Jeffrey as a receiver. He's off the charts, and he would be a much better option than Kenny Britt. Your concerns with him are injury-related. At times, he's had a tough time staying on the field in Chicago, and then also he had the PED suspension, and we know the Eagles have been down that road with Lane Johnson. And the last thing you want is strike two and that type of situation. So, hey, you always have concerns with just about everybody, but just from a pure football perspective, I think Jeffrey's head and shoulders above everybody else, and then it kind of fits in between there. And I think Kenny Britt would be a nice sort of compromise, a guy who has significant talent and wouldn't cost nearly as much money.
John McMullen talking with us about Eagles football and the NFL free agency that's set to get underway. Alan Barbre, John, a name that was came up over the weekend, given permission to find a new deal. Does that indicate to you that Isaac Seumalo is now the Eagles guy at that position?
Well, it would if they trade Allen. I still think there's some dominoes to fall. They've given him permission, so obviously they're not adverse to moving on. But I don't think they're adverse to moving on from Jason Kelce either. I think that's less likely. But if they were to move on from Jason Kelce, then all of a sudden I think Isaac Seumalo fits in at center, and Alan Barber probably is pulled off and stays. So I think we still have to see how the Eagles go about it. But it's pretty clear that at 33 years old, the Eagles are willing to move on from Alan Barber more so than Jason Kelce. But as you start making difficult decisions, Jason makes more money, and you would be able to garner more money under the cap. And if you need that money to get a significant player, you might have to revisit that decision.
Yeah, Barber's an interesting guy because he doesn't make that much money, and he could be a backup that can play many positions. I'm a little surprised that they're just willing to say, hey, go find yourself a trade.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised, too, because he was a very, very valuable player. And I think it's just the old NFL mentality of it's better to give up on a player a year too early than a year too late. They realize he's aging, number one. That was his best year by far in his career last season. So maybe the second part is they don't think he could do that again, and that could be it. But just forget about the starter. Just as a versatile guy, to be your sixth man on game day who can play every position on the line except center, that's a valuable guy to have.
Big and he only makes, what, 1.5 or $2 million? Not much more than that.
2.1, yeah. I think. So, yeah, he's cost effective. That one doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Chase Daniel. Teams interested in that in him? Is it because you have to pay Mike Glennon $14 million and you could say I can get comparable production from a guy making $7 million?
I would like to think people are smart enough to think that way in this league, but I think they won't blink and pay Mike Glennon $14 million and say, because you're not only with Mike Glennon, you're selling your fan base and even yourself hope, because you talk yourself into that he has this higher ceiling than a player that Chase Daniel has. And we always talk about the desperation of teams at the quarterback position, and it's real. And that's why you have a guy like, there's no doubt in my mind Mike Glennon's going to be a starter in this league, making anywhere from $13 to $15 million. And I wish teams would kind of spin it the way you did, Mike, and say, you know what? we'll probably get the same impact from Chase Daniel, pay half that money, but I just don't see teams thinking that way.
John, how about Michael Kendricks? Will he be an Eagle moving forward?
No, I don't think so. He's another guy they're trying to trade. I think part of what the Eagles had, and Sean Payton came out and finally admitted it, they're trading Brandon Cooks. Well, he wouldn't admit the real reason. That's the fact that he doesn't get along with him. But he mentioned to improve their defense. So what the Eagles have to offer is veteran players who could help, in theory, that terrible Saints defense right away, be it Connor Barwin or Michael Kendricks. Problem is they make significant amounts of money. And are the Saints willing to take on those contracts? They don't have a ton of salary cap room either. So it's going to be difficult for Howie to pull it off. But, yeah, I mean, Michael Kendricks is not going to be on the Eagles one way or the other for the 2017 season.
I'm also reading that the Eagles extended a second-round tender to restricted free agent tight end Trey Burton. Now, Burton's an interesting case because there was the guy that each week last season it seemed like we'd bring up of, are they going to get all three tight ends on the field? Is Trey Burton going to play a bigger role? Will Trey Burton play a bigger role in the Eagles' offense now that they've extended this second-round tender? Will he play a bigger role in their offense in 2017?
It depends how much Brent Selleck has left in the tank. Because the concern with Zach Ertz and Trey Burton being your two top tight ends is you got nobody who can block. And that's what Selleck does. He's not nearly as good as he used to be. And while that's not sexy or anything of that nature, that really hamstrings you in the running game, especially if you have a tight end who can't block. So that's the conundrum you're in if you want to move Burton up into the second tight end position, which by putting that tender, as you mentioned, Pete, that kind of indicates they want to do. And we'll see how it shakes out. But when you talk about three tight ends, the bottom line is the Eagles, Doug Peterson likes 11 personnel. And, hey, we saw it last year. The majority of the time they had three receivers on the field, and those were three terrible receivers. So they're going to play more often than not three wide receivers, a running back, and one tight end. And that, by nature, is going to limit the number of times the backup tight ends are on the field.
All right, John McMullen with NFL News and Notes. By the way, Torrey Smith released, that according to Steve Smith Sr., who says, according to sources, Torrey Smith will be released and become a free agent. Happy hunting, my dude. Steve Smith now.
Add him to the list.
Right, Steve Smith now. But I bring him up because why? He was as good as being traded to the Eagles at the trade deadline last year. We also learned this weekend that the Eagles did try to get Brandon Cooks at the deadline last year, couldn't get a deal done, and that they tried drafting him in 2014. So John thinks Cooks could be the top target, and Kenny Britt would be their next target. We'll see starting tomorrow. John will be back with the latest on the NFL News and Notes as legal tampering is open for business tomorrow. All right, John, we look forward to that.
All right, thank you, guys. Have fun.